My first day at the orphanage, I walked into Bundy Cottage, and there was a framed poster on the wall, and it was a quote by Oliver Goldsmith that said, "Success consists of getting up just one more time than you fall." And I just thought, I'd already fallen down. I was only, 14 years old maybe when I got to the orphanage, and already I'd been knocked down so many times.
Yeah, I was going to say knocked down. I don't think you fell. I think you were pushed.
Yeah.
This is A Joyful Rebellion, the podcast that explores that moment you realize the life and success you worked so hard to create didn't come with all the fulfillment you thought it would. I'm your host, James Walters, and I want you to be the author of your own story. Each week, I connect with people who inspire bold answers to the question, what do I do now to create a life I love? If you're ready to start answering that question for yourself, you're in the right place. So let's start A Joyful Rebellion. Whether you live in or have visited a city recently, you've probably encountered people without a place to call home. Many of us, myself included, experience that awkward tension when we think about how that person might have arrived in their circumstances and what we would do if we ever found ourselves in their shoes. Shayne Whitaker became homeless for the first time at age 4 and wrote a book about his experiences growing up. His book is called The Homeless Man's Journal, and it takes us through his journey from being abandoned by his mother at an early age, then living in a dysfunctional family situation for several years before opting to live in an orphanage, and ultimately getting in control of his own future. It's a story of resilience that echoes the sentiments of what A Joyful Rebellion is all about. And if you stick around till the end, I feel confident you'll gain a healthy dose of perspective from our conversation.
Shayne Whitaker, thank you for being here on this Joyful Rebellion today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be here. I appreciate it.
We're at the Union Station. It's the new train station, downtown Raleigh. And you lived a good part of your life in Raleigh.
A lot of my adult life. Yes.
Yeah, got a lot of roots here, but you've been all over the place. And we're here to talk about your journey from early childhood and here to talk about your first book. It's called The Homeless Man's Journal. It's based on a true story, and it's based on a story of someone who's really close to you, because I think it is you.
It is me. It's my story, my journal.
Secrets out of the bag.
Yeah.
In the first 2 minutes of the show.
Mm-hmm.
I read the book over the weekend. I just finished it about 3 hours ago. I had probably the last 25 pages to go since Sunday. And man, I gotta say, you've been geographically all over the place. You've seen a lot, you've done a lot, and you got a lot of stories. As I read through these pages, I felt like I went on the journey with you.
It's awesome.
And I know that's what every writer tries to do when they're putting words on the page. And I thought it was a really well-crafted story. It took me into, for better or for worse, because some of them I just wanted to throw punches at people. I got to admit, like there were some parts of the book where if I'd met those people in person, it wouldn't have gone well.
Right. I've heard that a lot.
Yeah, I bet you have. Man, I was so mad at them for you. But anyway, I don't want to give anything away in the book. Tell me what spurred this idea about the Homeless Man's Journal in the format that you wrote it and in the way that you wrote it. It starts with someone finding a journal at a bus stop.
Yeah. Well, obviously reading the book, I've been homeless a couple of times in my life. And the second time I was in Des Moines, Iowa. And where I ultimately settled to sleep at night was a bus stop right downtown. And there was a Burger King restaurant in the ground floor of a building right across the street. And some nights there would be a man that would come and unload supplies for the Burger King. And, when you're homeless, when you're sleeping in an environment like that, you don't really sleep well. You don't sleep soundly. So people walk by, you wake up. Obviously, if someone's unloading a transfer truck, you wake up. And it just kind of went through my mind, what did he think when he looked over at that bus stop? Did he think he saw a crackhead? Or what would he think? Because people have these perceptions, and would it have surprised him to know that I didn't do drugs, I didn't drink, that months before that I was a college student halfway across the country.
Yeah.
So visualizing that and thinking about what must have been going through his mind. So the premise of the book came about, the format that I did with the man finding the journal in the beginning, is I thought, what if I had left something there and told my story? Say that man across the street found it. Just what if you go to a bus stop and you think you're catching a bus?
Yeah.
The people that would come catch that bus during the day, throughout the day, they would never imagine that someone was sleeping there at night,
Right.
like I was. And I
Right.
just thought, what if they could see my story? And how would that change their perception? So that's why in the beginning he encounters a homeless man,
Right. Yeah.
does a lot of the things that we normally would do. We kind of avert our eyes. We don't want to engage.
Yeah.
And then if you read or you learn their story, would that change your perception or how you interact with people? And that's why in the conclusion of the book, he encounters that same homeless man, but he's changed by what he read. And so that was kind of the format, as I put this book together, I thought, what's the best format to tell it? Do I want to do it just like a typical biography type thing? I wanted to make it a little different where this character finds it and interacts with a homeless man and how that experience changes him. And it all went back to when I was sleeping on that bus stop in Des Moines, where I thought about the gentleman across the street there, what he would think when he saw me.
Yeah, that is wild you mentioned that, because that's, I had like the last 25 pages to read, and that was in that part of the book, because you were sleeping on the bus stop, but you had a job that you were going to every day, and you kind of stranded at that point because your car had broken down and you were far away from home. You were visiting one of your childhood friends / family friends, and all that gets mashed up in your life a lot. No fault of yours, but people around you came in and out of your life. But the thing I want people to hear is that you first became homeless when you were 4 years old.
Yeah.
And this happens like in the first 20 pages of the book.
You always want to draw a reader into the story and get their attention and kind of try to hook them. So you always want something that's going to draw them in. And so I thought that's where I was going to start, with my mother abandoning me. As I wrote the book, I never thought of myself as homeless when that happened. But then I realized it. My mother put me in a chair and she walked out, and I was left there at 4 years old in a public place, and eventually was put in foster care. But that's a sad place for anybody to be. But you're a 4-year-old kid and you're literally homeless now because your mother just walked out the door, and I never saw her again.
Wow.
The rest of my life.
Well, that was one of the questions I wanted to ask, because by the time I got to the end of the book, and I know she had passed around 05.
A little bit later than that.
Okay. Because your grandparents were kind of passing around that.
My grandmother passed in 2004.
Yeah. Okay, so you were 4 years old, and man, you're like 3 years older than me, maybe, and I vividly remember my mom was a single mom. She would take me places like the DMV, or she would take me and I just remember exactly how you described it, just working with my Matchbox car or whatever, and for way longer than you should leave a 3-year-old, 4-year-old, or what.
Right.
I guess in my mind, kids have a skewed perspective of time. It could have been 15 minutes. It felt like 4 hours. But as you were going through that, I was like, nobody would do that now. But that was so normal when we were kids, like in the early 70s and mid 70s. Nobody thought a thing about it.
Yeah, you're in the car with no seatbelt on and all that.
Oh, dude. But that one where you rode up on the speakers, and I totally did that on the way. So my mom got remarried. I was probably 4. Because I was so small, I guess they took one for the team. They were going to go to Disney World for their honeymoon and drag me along with them.
Nice.
And I was in this little hatchback, no back seat. It was 2-seater, but I was in the window, 4 years old, riding to friggin' Florida 10-something hours. And I just remember, that's how we rolled.
Yep.
I don't want to dismiss how heavy this is. It took a couple hours for people to realize, this kid's mom's not here anymore. Then all of a sudden you were confused. You got these people who seemed nice enough, but you knew that you had to go. They had to get you somewhere, had to get you safe. And that's when you went into the foster home. And that's kind of when things began.
Yeah. One thing that surprised me, my memory, I still vividly remember the day I arrived at the foster home. I remember the foster mother. I remember her yardstick very well.
Oh, man.
I remember sitting at a table full of a bunch of other kids and sitting around that table, and then the nice social worker would come and take me to get my vaccinations and that kind of thing, or take me to the park and that kind of thing, and then eventually being asked if I wanted to go back to my father. But
was it asked, or was it?
It was kind of asked.
Okay.
And so because as I grew, I kind of wondered if I should have regretted that decision.
Yeah.
As the hardships piled up, as my life was miserable, I wondered, hey, should I have stayed in a foster home in Oregon? Did I make the right decision? you're putting all this pressure and trying to remember that you were 4 years old at the time.
Exactly. Yeah.
But you still question it. But yes, the foster mother and the social worker took me out on the front steps of the house, and that's when they basically asked me, "Do you want to go back and live with your father?"
Okay.
And I guess in my mind, I was thinking my mother would be there, my family,
Yeah.
So I'm thinking the family's going back together, as
That
dysfunctional
youthful
as it is.
optimism.
Right.
Right. And when you got there, that wasn't the case at all, because
No.
father and your mother, they were both dysfunctional in their own ways.
Mm-hmm.
And you did end up going to live with your dad, but he pretty much, I don't know, he went through a lot of stuff, it sounded like, in Vietnam.
Yeah, I often think about Vietnam causing him problems. My mother would say Vietnam had more to do with him getting on drugs than her influence, for example.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm sure he probably saw some bad things there. Sometimes at night, if I walked in the room, he would kind of jerk awake. So I'm sure he did have some issues from that. Even so, I think ultimately we are who we choose to be. You may have gone through that experience, but how you treat people, how you treat your children, you're still in control of that ultimately. But he did have some issues, obviously. Maybe that's what skewed him toward violence even. I'm not sure. But I've often thought about that, about the impact that had on him.
And when you came back to live with your dad, wasn't that kind of after he had met up with a group of other people working at carnivals and traveling around and sort of having that life transient?
That's true. Yeah, apparently when my parents were divorced, my father went and worked on a traveling carnival. He operated this ride called the Zipper. He'd talk about it, and he would try to get people to flip upside down and shake change out of their pocket. That was how he was. But they'd met these other people that worked the carnival, and we'd travel around like a bunch of gypsies.
Yeah.
This family and our family, and at first it seemed okay because we were living near my grandparents here in North Carolina. So here I am. I'm not even 5 years old yet. I've already been coast to coast and having that experience and that kind of uprooting, if you will.
When you were with your grandparents, which is your father's parents, and that's in Oxford, and they were very warm. You'd work with your grandfather out in the garden. I have all those, same memories because I hung out with my grandparents a lot. So the way you described it is like, yeah, I knew what that was like too. And I was like, yeah, that's so awesome you had that experience. But then it sort of seemed like you got thrown in the fire because I sensed that your grandparents wanted the best for you. They wanted the best for their son. And like people of that generation, they didn't hold back on their opinions on how that should go.
No, my grandfather was very opinionated and bold with it.
I feel like some of the travel, some of the things that your father did was just sort of rebelling against what his parents wanted him to do.
I definitely think that was a part of it because, when he was near my grandfather would drag him to the barbershop if he had to get a haircut.
Right.
They would make him dress decent, whereas my father was more like, he wanted to be like the Harley guy, the Hells Angels guy. He wanted to be like that. And so I do think a lot of the traveling was to escape initial traveling, leaving Oxford when I was young. I think that was a big part of my father trying to escape the sphere of influence of my grandfather.
Yeah.
But of course, there were ramifications for that, certainly on me.
Yeah, there was certainly for you because you went from that nice, stable, loving household of your grandparents into who the hell knows what's going to happen today, tomorrow. And it made me chuckle and made me sad all at the same time because when you were young enough and old enough at the same time to notice, like, man, I go for days sometimes without eating food, but we've always got HBO.
Oh, yeah.
And
I figured he was stealing it or something. If we weren't paying for it, he's probably going out there and stealing it and at the jack, the cable line.
That was that time in the world where HBO, like not everybody had that.
Yeah.
You had to have the box, and it was not just a flip of a switch.
Right.
And it was expensive for the time because it was fairly new. So the adults around you kind of prioritized that sort of stuff over things that would be basic. Walk me through a little bit more of the process because at the point we're talking, I mean, you're between 4 and maybe 6, 7 years old when you really start going across country and then they start meeting up with this other family, the people they met at working the carnival. Your dad at this point has, is she the girlfriend or they got married?
They were married by that time, as far as I knew.
Gotcha.
But they did, I think, have a ceremony years later, so perhaps they weren't, but I was under the impression that they were. Within that whole clan, you just never knew what dynamics there were.
Right, because your father would introduce somebody as grandma this or that, and they
Uncle
had no
somebody.
Yeah, uncle this, and they had no blood relation to you whatsoever, but
No.
that's just how they,
Yeah.
what they called it. You were around a lot of adults who didn't think twice about that whole spare the rod, spoil the child
Oh, yeah.
kind of thing. If you grow up in that situation, you don't know what you don't know. You know it's not right, but it's normal
Yeah.
in some of those cases. So what impact did that have? Because you saw that happen to the other kids your age just as well.
When you're in that environment, it's certainly not a loving environment. You see that people are just kind of indifferent to you. There's not that love. I've known friends, known people who their families were very affectionate. They hugged, and as I would always explain to them, you know, when someone's arms went out in my house, you were getting hit. And you just never understood it. You could never comprehend it because it would be for any reason at all. You were too loud. You didn't pull the door closed completely. You left the cap on the dish detergent pulled up. You know,
Right.
just any
Yeah.
little thing that you would get hit about. And it just would come out of nowhere. So you were kind of always on edge. I think all of the children that were in that house were where you always had your shoulders tense, bracing yourself for what was to come. You didn't know when, but you just always kind of braced for it because you were almost treated like an annoyance. It was uncommon for them to just lock us outside, even in wintertime. For example, the first place we lived with this other family was in Spokane, Washington. That kind of alludes to how much traveling we did. I started kindergarten in Oxford and here in North Carolina. And in first grade, I'm in Spokane, Washington. So it was that far that we traveled. But you just never knew. You almost dreaded going home after school. Even though school was miserable,
Yeah.
you dreaded going home because the bigger bullies were at home.
Right.
And they hit harder, and there was no teacher to rein
And there was
them
no
in.
standing up to them.
Right.
Wow. I know you've probably asked this question. I don't know if you've asked the question to the people responsible for it, but it seems like there were a lot of parts in the book where I guess I wondered, why did your father and his wife want to keep you around? Like, what was in it for them? Because they could have just dropped you off at your grandparents and called it a day, and your grandparents probably would have loved it.
I think my grandparents, I even think my grandmother told me once, she was the one that found where I was in the foster home.
Okay.
And had initially thought about getting me, but felt like they had to defer to my father.
Okay.
And I think sometimes the reason they kept me, I think my grandmother often kind of put that pressure on my father, which if we get to the point later in the book, there's a perfect example of that about my grandmother, her influence on my father, wanting him to be a father, I guess, and be
Right.
a dad. It's hard to explain why they didn't just drop us off somewhere. Maybe in their own way they wanted me to be with them. I don't know.
It didn't seem like at any point he was trying to prove anything to your grandparents. But at the same time, I also wondered, well, maybe he is just keeping you away from them in spite, but then he'd send you back there in the summer. We may never know these things, right? But that's what I was asking when I was like, what's going on? But
Yeah. After we left Oxford, I didn't see my grandparents again until I was probably in the third grade when they came to Wyoming.
okay.
Saw them briefly there, and then they visited in Iowa. So it was right before I, like middle school, junior, like by the 8th grade is when I
Okay.
went to spend the summer with them.
Gotcha.
By the 8th grade is when I went to visit them that summer. You know, I would see them periodically throughout the life as we traveled because my grandparents would get an RV and they would travel. So I saw them in Wyoming, for example,
Okay.
or in a couple years later in Iowa when we were there. And then eventually they settled back in Oxford to be near my grandfather's mother. Mm-hmm. So when we were living in Tennessee, right, next state, right next door, that's when they sent me to stay with them those summers.
Okay. How old were you then?
I was about 13 when I first went to visit them for the summer.
Okay. So yeah, a lot of time had passed. A lot of
I've lived with my father about 10 years before I went to the orphanage there. So
Okay.
I was with my father for about 10 years.
as we go through the book, every time summer would come up, or I guess turn of the page of the calendar, I was like, okay, he's closer to the point where he's going to be able to stand up to his father. And did that point ever come? I know it's not in the book necessarily, but did that ever come to a point where,
Maybe close to it, maybe about
Yeah.
a year before I went to the orphanage.
okay,
It's kind of like more than just standing up to him. I often thought about escaping.
right. And you tried.
I did. I mean, I ran away when I was 8 years old.
Yeah.
First time I ran away, we were living in that motel.
Yeah.
And life was miserable. Just even that was the third grade. I think I was 8 years old. And that 1 year in that town in Rock Springs, Wyoming, kind of was a microcosm of my life in a way, because even within that town, for 1 year, I went to 2 different schools and we had 3 different addresses, including a motel. So that kind of shows that chaotic, rootless existence, just even within 1 year there, that I endured most of the time with my father.
In that town, you went from, wasn't it a pretty decent sized house with lots of outdoor options to...
We lived up near my Uncle Tom.
Right,
my
your
late
Uncle Tom, yeah.
And I enjoyed that.
Yeah.
He was just down the road from us, enjoyed visiting him, playing with his dog, that kind of thing. There was a disconnect between him and my father when this other family showed up again. I think that kind of burned some bridges because we moved from there and I didn't really see my uncle much after that, even though we still lived in the same town.
Right.
But yeah, we went from there to a motel before going to some pretty crusty apartments after that.
Wow.
But spent Thanksgiving, Christmas in that motel. So I always remember that holiday. I got one gift, a stuffed animal that I woke up and found in the middle of the night on Christmas Eve.
I feel like, and the reason I wanted to have this conversation with you is because, reading through your book and what A Joyful Rebellion is all about, it's about that time where you realize something needs to change in your life, and then you have to decide what you're going to do about it. And sometimes that means burning certain bridges. Sometimes that means going against family programming. Now, I wouldn't say you had very much overt family programming, like do this, don't do that, but you were around a lot of people that were not functional. Yeah. And my biggest impression over the course of reading the book is there's some people who maybe their parents are drug abusers or alcoholics and they become that way too because that's what they witnessed for so long. Then there are others who, because they were exposed to that, they're like, I'll never be like that. And it sounds like you went the second route. You started surrounding yourself with basketball, positive people, and then you ended up at the orphanage, which it sounded like one of the other themes is that the structure of the orphanage, then the structure of the military, then the structure of college really did a lot of good for you. So talk a little bit about when you did finally get to the orphanage, what that was like going from chaos. And you never knew when you were going to get hit. You never knew, what was the next thing lurking around the corner to a stable, we're going to eat dinner at this time. There's going to be dinner there every single day. And then you're going to go to school. You're going to go to the same place for a couple years in a row. Mm-hmm. What was that adjustment like for you?
I'll say the orphanage, I often say this, it saved my life. What's known today as the Masonic Home for Children at Oxford. It was known as Oxford Orphanage during my time there. It changed my life. It gave me structure. There's so many things that are vital to kids to succeed that I didn't have before I went there. Just even prior to going there, I probably slept on a mattress on the floor for at least the last year and a half before I went there. And, living upstairs in a house in a very rough neighborhood in Nashville, Tennessee, where there was always violence and all kinds of drugs and stuff in the neighborhood. My father bought his, marijuana and speed and stuff like a block away from our house, I'm going to school with holes in my knees and stained clothes and things that don't fit and didn't know how to comb my hair, shower, or anything like that. So I still remember my first day at the orphanage and being introduced to my counselor. All the other kids were off working because it was summertime when I arrived, and the kids were off working at the farm or doing whatever they did. So the cottage was pretty empty, and counselor took me up into a room where there were 4 beds. They were lined up, and I got the one that was on the left side. He told me I just had one little suitcase, with a few clothes my grandparents had provided for me. And I just remember I immediately knew it was going to be life-altering for me because my counselor said, here's your bed. Here's what they called a case. It was your closet and your drawers. And, you put your clothes in your case. Once you're done with that, let me know. Come on down, and I'll take you up to the clothing department, and we'll get you some new clothes. Yeah. This may sound silly to people, but when you grew up with next to nothing, I remember I asked him, when he told me to get some clothes, I asked him, I said, even socks and underwear? And he said, yes, even socks and underwear. And for some reason, it just blew my mind that I could get socks and underwear that had never been worn, or socks that were clean. For some reason, it just blew my mind. And I remember going to the clothing department, and you're used to going to Salvation Army or Goodwill. My parents would go there and bargain hunt. Like, they'd look for the holes in the knees. Wow. So to walk out of that clothing department at the orphanage with an armful of clothes and to go put them on a bed that's not on the floor now was just such a neat experience. Now, it's still a dramatic experience. You're in this cottage with 24 other boys, and it's a scary thing. It saved my life. But when you first go there, it's scary. I mean, as I wrote in the book, I cried myself to sleep the first night. Rolled over and faced the wall so the other boys in the room wouldn't hear me, and so because I realized I was in a better place, but still kind of sad that I had to be there. And you knew it still wasn't like a normal, if you will. One of my best friends told me he cried pretty much every night the first year he was there.
Wow.
So it's an adjustment to go to that kind of environment. But eventually I had a routine. I would go to school. We all had jobs back then, so I went to work at the print shop. I was kind of lucky with that because I had to be in the air conditioning.
That's a plush job, actually.
Yeah, because I actually got in there earlier than I was supposed to. I was too young to really work there, but my counselor thought I was smart.
Yeah.
And he pulled some strings and got me in there, so I was lucky. But you had that routine.
Right.
And then it's just like any other environment. You're getting to know people, getting to know your fellow students and all. But you finally had this, like you said, a set meal time, and food was going to be there and plenty of it, and sheets and a blanket on your bed. We had to wash our own clothes, so I kind of had to learn trial by fire to do that.
Yeah.
But you had everything you needed. We had soap, we had washcloths, clothes, and then you had that routine where you get up in the morning, and we would, in the younger cottages, like when I first got there, you would line up. And we'd kind of just march up to the cafeteria and at a particular time and eat. And you went off to school. First year I was there, we walked to school. It was such a unique experience arriving there and acclimating to it. I can't really tell you how long it took me or how long it took kids in general, but I think like a lot of kids, you arrive there, you're scared. But as you form these bonds with the other kids and you see you're not hungry, nobody's going to come in drunk in the middle of the night and yank you out of the bed and beat on you. Yeah. You don't have to worry about some pedophile coming in to the room at night. You could actually sleep because you didn't have to sleep in fear that somebody was going to come in and do you harm in the night. There was air conditioning, in the cottage, which,
you weren't used to that.
Right. So it's an adjustment, but then eventually you realize this is a path to a better life. This is the first time I have what I need.
How long did it take you to realize, because there are a lot of layers to every little thing that's going on, because while you were at the orphanage is in Oxford. Mm-hmm. So are your grandparents.
Yeah.
They were right down the road.
6 miles away.
Yeah. So did that mess with you?
It changed the dynamic in the sense of, I think my grandparents were a little embarrassed that their son's child was there.
Okay.
When I first went there, my grandparents would come visit me. When you first arrived at the orphanage, there was an acclimation period. You couldn't see family. You couldn't go anywhere.
Okay.
So you stayed there, and they wanted you to get acclimated to it. And then after a while, you could go visit home on a weekend or something like that.
Okay.
And so initially, my grandparents would do that. They would take me home, maybe come visit me. When on my birthday or something, my grandparents might come up and visit me. But I think there was an embarrassment for my grandparents that I was there because they knew people in town. My great-grandfather used to have a little business in town. So I think they were embarrassed by it. And that caused a bit of a schism in the sense that my grandmother would kind of deny anything that had ever happened. You weren't abused, you didn't have it that bad. And that really hurt me, and it hurt our relationship because I felt like I've shed a lot of tears in my life. I've endured a lot in my life, and how can you deny me my pain?
Yeah.
How can you deny this? And that went on really into my adulthood until I finally had a breakthrough with my grandmother one day. And when she was again kind of denying, and I said, Grandma, I lived in an orphanage 6 miles from your house. That in and of itself says something wasn't right.
Yeah.
So I think, and she realized that, and we never really had that conversation again after that. But it was a tough dynamic. We drifted apart during the years I was there because I became more headstrong and independent and confident. So I wasn't going to tolerate sitting there being told that nothing had happened. I would just rather stay with my friends. And there were other hurtful things. For example, when I played basketball on the orphanage basketball team, they never came to a single game. They lived 6 miles away and never came. That was one of those deep hurts that I always had there.
And that's a generation that had just so much pride in what their reputation was that they had built for themselves, and they wanted to appear upstanding to their community. And for whatever reason, that generation, I witnessed it in my own family, where if something that didn't reflect well on what they tried to build, even though it wasn't in their control, and it was usually some, crazy thing one of their kids did, who was the generation above us, right?
Yeah.
But they somehow took on the responsibility of that tarnishing their reputation, and man, they would just like fire extinguish it, or they would totally deny it.
Yeah.
And so that's what happened to you, and that had to put strain on your relationship. But at some points in the book, it felt like you reminded them of how much of a screw up their son was.
I think so. And it caused a rift with us because, like I said, they wouldn't come to the basketball games, or they would only call up there. If I ever got in trouble, they would call. But if I ever did something good, like when I won first place in a U.S. history contest, a little project I did for history class, or when I went to Boy State, which I was very proud of. Whenever I did something like that, I felt like I was representing not just myself, but all of us, the kids that were at the orphanage. Only 500 11th graders get to go to Boy State each year. So to be one of those I was very proud of that because I thought, this is the kind of thing that shows that even kids like in an orphanage, these kids that are kind of been cast away, maybe forgotten by a lot of society, they're just as capable as anybody else. Your life matters, and that you can do something, you can achieve things, and you're just as capable as anybody else. And so proud of that kind of thing. But I would never get the phone call from them saying, we're proud of you.
Yeah.
But if I ever got in trouble, call it, what the heck were you doing? What were you thinking?
Right.
That kind of thing. So that did cause a rift between me and them. And I love my grandparents, and I think the story with me and my grandfather, it's a story just about forgiveness and about always trying to be better. I think it speaks highly of you. If you can be good to people who haven't always been good to you, people who have hurt you, if you can still be good to them, that speaks well of you.
Gotta admit, I was having a real hard time summoning those feelings as I was reading through some of the things that were happening to you. You're a better person than me because...
I think about with my grandfather, despite all that had happened, when he passed, I was there holding his hand and telling him it was okay. I don't know how you get there. I don't think there's a real roadmap to get to that point in your life.
Yeah.
I guess at one point I just kind of realized that any kind of bitterness that I held on to, it was only affecting me. The other people, they didn't care.
Yeah.
They weren't hurt by how I was feeling or how I was reacting. It was only affecting me.
Right.
And so I was like, at some point you got to learn how to deal with that and let it go as best you can. It'll always be there. That hurt will always be there.
Right.
But holding my grandfather's hand, being there for him at the very end, I can look at myself in the mirror and say, I'm a good man. I did the right thing.
For a lot of people, that's a great lesson right there and a great example. The fact that you could do that and not just either shut them out and say, okay, you're just another one of these people that's just trying to make my life miserable or whatever. But the fact that you did keep going and coming around, and there's a theme in your book, and I want you to talk about it because it's something you read one day, but it's kind of the theme that runs all the way through the book. It's one of those things that people who understand it and actually do it the way you did, they achieve a different level of success with whatever it is they're trying to do. Sometimes that's just stay alive.
Right.
Tell us about that theme, and I think you know what I'm talking about.
My first day at the orphanage, I walked into Bundy Cottage, and there was a framed poster on the wall, and it was a quote by Oliver Goldsmith that said, "Success consists of getting up just one more time than you fall." And that just resonated with me. And I just thought, I'd already fallen down. I was only, 14 years old maybe when I got to the orphanage, and already I'd been knocked down so many times.
Yeah, I was going to say knocked down. I don't think you fell. I think you were pushed.
Yeah. I think what's important in that, what needs to accompany that, is something that motivates you, something that inspires you, something that makes you find hope. You've got to have something that gives you hope. For me, it was writing. I enjoyed writing. I drew a picture in the 6th grade, and I just said, this is neat. This is fun. I want to do this. I want to tell stories.
Yeah.
Have a goal. Have something that keeps you going. But sometimes it might only be getting to the next day. Sometimes that's a victory, just making it to the next day. And we'll go through days of sadness and sorrow and difficulty. But if you can just make it through that day, then the next day's another opportunity. So I stuck with that, even in the orphanage, getting acclimated to the place, and just times where I failed there, where I got in trouble, But I would realize, okay, this isn't the right path. And any time where I had a chance to give up, or it would have been easy to give up, being homeless, your car catches fire, and next thing you know, you're homeless, and it's like, what do you do? But you can't just give up.
Right.
Because even when I was homeless the first time, as you might recall in the book, I would have an old spiral notebook and just a pen, and I would stick it in and hide it in the bushes and take it in the library. So I could always escape into my imagination, and I'd get out of the heat in the library and just escape into my imagination. But that belief that if you just keep getting back up, that eventually good things will happen, that you'll get where you're trying to go, no matter how many times you get knocked down. I've been knocked down a lot. Yeah. But you always have to get back up and have something that motivates you to do so. For me, that was writing, and I just thought, I'm not just going to end up here. This isn't, I've overcome too much already. Yeah. I'm not going to just end up here on the street like this.
It sounded like you were in an environment in the orphanage where you really thrived because of the structure, the support that you got. Then you graduated high school, and then you went to your first year of college, and seemed like it was a little touch and go.
Got the shock of my life my freshman year of college.
Yeah. Is that because there was structure there, but not as much structure? Like, they were telling you where to be and when, but not necessarily what to do?
Right. My class at the orphanage was the last one where when you graduated, out you went. Yeah. That was it. The year after I graduated, they started what they called independent living, which kind of helped better prepare kids for going out into the world, for being more independent. The night I graduated from high school, I didn't even know where I was going to stay that night.
Yeah.
You know, I was just fortunate that a family that had tried to adopt me once tapped me on the shoulder and told me to come see them when I was done saying goodbye to my orphanage classmates. And so when you're faced with that kind of uncertainty, it kind of carries on. And of course, then you're trying to get on your feet. You know, I get to college, and then right when I think I'm kind of starting to rebound and climb, I get the biggest shock of my life with my mother there. So
who you thought was dead.
I had convinced myself that my mother was dead. As a kid growing up, I never imagined going to see my mother or visit her. I always dreamed I will go see her grave one day.
Okay.
Because I knew she was a drug addict. I knew she had lived a very dangerous life since she was a teenager.
Yeah.
And so I never thought about seeing her. I just thought about going to her grave one day. I can still remember it. I mean, you talk about tears and anger and just upwelling of emotion.
Yeah.
You know, when somebody comes in and says, you know, that your mother's going to call you. And at first I thought he was talking about my father's, you know, I think third wife. Yeah, he was on the third wife by then.
That's right.
And so I thought, well, why is she going to call me? Because I don't have anything to do with her. And then, of course, he tells me your mother in California.
Yeah.
And I just kind of instinctively knew. And I remember getting angry and telling him, don't joke like that.
Yeah.
And I can still remember the first words I exchanged with her. I answered the phone and she asked for Shayne, and I said, this is he. And she said, hi, Shayne. It's Mom. And I just felt like,
you're like, I don't know.
Yeah, like you don't have the right to call yourself that.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I thought. And,
yeah.
And again, having overcome so much even prior to that point, like I really gained confidence in myself and felt like any challenge that I met in life I could overcome. I mean, for example, at the orphanage, you know, my father removed me from the orphanage, took me all the way to Kansas. I think that was at my grandmother's urging. I think she was embarrassed, but by the end of that summer, I had convinced my father to let me go back to the orphanage. And it's one of those things when I wrote the book, I was kind of surprised by what kind of blew my mind that I never really thought about much.
Yeah.
But one of the things that blew my mind, I never thought about it until I written the book, was I was 16 years old and I got on a Greyhound bus in Kansas by myself and rode halfway across country to go live in an orphanage.
Yeah.
And that's just one of those things that when I look back on it, kind of amazed me that I had done that. But I had done that kind of thing to try and get where I wanted to be in life. And then to get to college and my mother resurfaces, it just rock bottom.
Yeah, when she came back in your life, it just really messed with your head.
Oh, it did. And she would call me every night, high as a kite. I failed every class that semester. I was getting knocked down in major ways with this.
That's about the time in the book where I identified something that I like to talk to people about. And that's whenever someone like yourself has a really traumatic story or they've had a lot of hardships. Sometimes people will make the mistake, and their intentions are good, but they'll make the mistake of what I call engaging in the victim Olympics. I remember you had a roommate, and he was like, my mom's a single mom too, or something like that. And they try to share, oh yeah, we've all got it hard. Do you find that happens when you're talking about the book, or toward the end of the book, you've talked to a lot of groups of orphans, and because you've shared their story, you can tell them about your story, but you didn't present it in a way like, oh yeah, I've had hardship as well. You're just telling them what happened.
I remembered when I was at the orphanage, when people would come and speak to us, maybe at a chapel service, and they would say they were products of divorce. Yeah. It's easy for folks like me and people in the orphanage to tune that out, because to them, you're lucky. Right. You still had one parent that loved you. Yeah. You still got to live at home. You were still spoiled. You still had family holidays. So to them, you're not really empathizing with them. You're just telling to them you're lucky. And so I can remember in college going to speak in an orphanage. We were in a group that would go and do this kind of thing. And I remember kind of asking this gentleman if I could be the speaker, because I told him it's no offense, but these kids will tune you out, whereas they will not me. And that was just one of the most rewarding experiences of my life, was going. It was actually an orphanage in Thomasville, the Mills Home, which was founded by the same man that founded the orphanage where I grew up. The one where I grew up is the oldest one in North Carolina. It goes back to right after the Civil War. But yeah, I mean, even recently, the orphanage had where I grew up, they had the baccalaureate service at the end of school, and I was very honored to be asked to speak there. And so I did. And one thing I said to the kids when I got up there to speak, I said, you know, I've sat where you are, and I know it's easy to tune people out because they haven't had your experience. And I said, but I've had your experience. I've been there. So I think that helps bring their attention in, you know, when they understand that somebody can relate to that. It doesn't mean they tune everybody out completely. Yeah. Like I said, I didn't want to get into any kind of, I've had it worse than anybody else. But when you get people that, in your eyes, have had a pretty decent life, tell you that they can understand, and you realize they really can't
but
sometimes.
Can you?
Yeah.
And the reason I wanted to bring that up, and I call it the Victim Olympics, not to make light or anything like that, but I've seen situations where people are like, oh yeah, this thing happened to me, or hey, this is why I react this way. Like you were talking about, if somebody flails their arm and out to hug you, you're like, whoa, what? You back away. Sometimes people try to either make themselves feel better, or they try to make the other person better by doing that whole one-upping.
Right.
Like, oh, but I was homeless 6 times, or whatever it is. Do you find that happens at all now, years removed, when you're talking to people, talking to groups, anything like that?
Not so much. I mean, and it could be my own attitude, maybe how I perceive things, because you see it a little bit sometimes, but you also have to understand people handle things completely differently.
Yeah.
I've got a Facebook page for my author profile, the Homeless Man's Journal page as well. And I'd recently spoken about victims of violence and sexual abuse as kids. If there's things that are concerning to me in life, or I know people having to endure something, like I'll go to my social media page and I'll write about it. Because sometimes we hear about things like this, like these kids are molested, or human trafficking, or child pornography, and we don't put a face on it. So I posted one picture of me as a kid that I thought really was almost like a chronicle of my childhood and the things that I went through. My cheeks were puffy from being smacked so much. My hair was raggedy. My eyes, you could tell I had been crying recently before the picture was taken. And so I posted that picture and I talked about the things that I endure, because I want to say there's a face on all these kids. You hear about these things, and so many people are willing to turn a blind eye to that, and I think that's so scary and dangerous, and you compromise yourself morally if you do that. If you're being ignorant of that kind of thing, you're going to pay with your integrity, I think. And so I put my picture and put a face on it, and I just remember a man that replied to the post and said, "Man, you described my life to a T." Wow. He said, "And I'm glad you were able to deal with it." He said, "I haven't." He said, "I went through drugs and alcohol." He said, "I'm not drinking and doing drugs now." But he said, "There's some days like I wish God would take me instead of somebody else." So you see that perception. Now, we may have all been through similar things, but not everybody's going to handle those things the same way. So when it comes to people saying, like you said, "Oh, I've been homeless this many times," I try to be more sensitive to what folks are going through. Like this gentleman that replied to this post, that I don't know how I was able to do it and he didn't. We all deal with things differently, and I certainly replied to him and tried to offer some encouragement. But you do see some of that. So I always try to be aware of how what I went through is obviously very traumatic, but sometimes somebody may be dealing with depression for some reason. And I understand that could be crippling for them. For whatever reason, whatever they've gone through, that could be crippling for them. Pain can be relative. I've endured a mountain of stuff, but even somebody that may be like, I have friends that deal with depression, or maybe a job loss or something. And it's all relative, because for them that can still be as monumental as the things that I went through. So I try to remember that, and try not to get into who's had the hardship Olympics or something, if you will. Because you do get that. You do get people, "Oh, well, I was hit 14 times with a tarp strap," that kind of thing. So you do get that, and I think I blow it off more than anything now.
Right.
Because you get people that like, "Well, we just had a little bit to eat." And I'm like, "Did you go stand in line and get cheese? Did you get powdered milk?"
Your grandmother actually did that to you in a way when she tried to deny your experience. She was like, "Well, it's not like you got locked in a closet," or she didn't mention all the other stuff that was horrific. She's just like, "Okay, here's the worst thing I can think of, and that didn't happen to you, so you're fine."
Right.
And that made you feel a certain kind of way for sure. But right after that first year in college, where you're kind of feeling that independence until the record scratched when your mom made that first phone call, and then it was not so great after that. Then you decided to go into the Army, the National Guard. And that seemed like a really pivotal turning point in your life.
That almost kind of rebuilt me, I guess you could say. When I was at the orphanage and I went to Boys State, and I did pretty decent in school. I wasn't a scholar student or anything like that. But, here I came in the gate at the orphanage as this disheveled, skinny kid that didn't know how to comb my hair, didn't know what was expected of me in life. And I went to Boys State, and I won a ribbon in a history contest and played on the basketball team, and gained this confidence where I felt like I've overcome so much that I felt like if there was any obstacle in life, I could overcome it. So my mother resurfacing humbled me big time. You realize there are things in life that you can't handle alone. That's when I found faith during that semester, because I just was lost and felt like I needed something to help me. And so when I left that semester, I'd failed every class. It was so traumatizing, but I knew I wasn't going to give up. I knew I still wanted to do something. I needed to prove something to myself.
Yeah.
I needed to show that if I still work hard at something, then good things will happen. And I got something in the mail one day from the Army Reserve, and I just walked down to the National Guard Armory in Oxford, and I remember the sergeant walking into the recruiter's office saying, hey, I'm about to make your day, because they don't just walk in like that. You know?
Okay.
And that's what I did. I ended up joining the National Guard, and then, again, a new challenge, though, because, Saddam Hussein goes into Kuwait right before I joined.
Yeah.
So you're going through boot camp, and nobody knew it was going to be as decisive as it was, that war. And they were really preparing us for the worst, because, Saddam liked to throw gas canisters around like a short order cook throwing eggs, So it's like they were preparing us for the worst. So you would go to bed at night and think, for all I know, I could be dead in 3 months or something after I get out of here if I go off to war. And you had that hanging over you. But I was just really driven to say, I'm going to get through this. I'm going to prove to myself that I've still got what it takes, and that good things can happen. And so went through basic training, went straight from basic training down to the Army Signal Corps Training School at Fort Gordon, and just worked really hard and ended up distinguished honor graduate, top of my class. That's still one of my most proud achievements because of where I was in life when I entered that. My mother resurfacing, I'm at rock bottom, and there's a war going on, and to graduate top of my class and know that I put in the effort and studied, and I walked out a whole different man physically and mentally. I walked out 19 pounds heavier from the muscle I put on. Nice. And of course you never see what's right around the corner. Within 6 months I was homeless for the first time. So you never know. Life can be a roller coaster. But having had that experience, graduating top of my class, going through that, I think even when I was homeless, reminded me that, hey, you just did something. You just came through something, and you stood back up, and you can do it again here.
The other thing that really jumps out off of the page, and we talked a little bit about it, is people that you surround yourself with is so important. Because you made a lot of good friends in the orphanage. Obviously, you were there for probably the longest that you'd been
in my youth.
In any place.
Yeah, in my youth, that was definitely most stable.
Any stable place. Because the Army, all that training, it didn't last as long because just the way it goes. But you really wanted to filter in the good people.
Yeah.
And you didn't get caught up in the kind of people you were used to.
Right.
And that sort of came to a head when you reconnected with one of your childhood people years later. And how old were you guys when you reconnected?
Oh, gosh, probably.
Because you were the similar age.
Close in age.
Within a year or so.
I might have been around 24, 25.
Okay.
If I'm thinking right.
She calls you up and she's like, hey, come out here to kind of the middle of the country. And you had to do something for the summer. You had to leave school. And you're like, okay, that might be cool to reconnect. And you get out there and you realize, wow, you chose one path. And she basically kind of did a copy and paste of where she came from.
I think kind of what you were alluding to there a minute ago about it's important to surround yourself with good people and good things. I had an ex-girlfriend that used to always tell me that I made her a better person. That's the kind of people you want to surround yourself with, people that make you a better person. And so I was fortunate to do that, to be around people who are that demonstrated kindness, that were willing to help people, that were more upstanding and I guess just better character than what I'd been around growing up. And I think that's important, to surround yourself with good people. I'm still friends with people I knew in college, and they're good people. And I remember when I went out there to Iowa and we're talking with her, and all my friends are drug addicts and jailbirds and all this, and your friends are lawyers and all this kind of stuff. And I said, the kind of friends you have, though, they don't pick you all the time. You pick your friends as well. Ultimately, you are who you choose to be, and who you choose to associate with, and who you choose to surround yourself with is important, because that's going to have an influence on you and enable you to have a better influence on other people. And that was part of my reason going out there. I thought I can be a positive influence, and then of course torpedoed on
sort
me.
of backfired. Not a little bit. You live and learn, right? But here's the other thing. You probably have a real understanding and some compassion for how she ended up where she was, because she never had the benefit of going to the orphanage.
Right. I've definitely thought about that, about people from my past that never had that lifeline or that escape. And I'm very thankful for my time.
She was
there.
just like repeating the same day over and over again for that whole time.
It just showed how much that stability in your life, having the things that you need, Somebody once asked me, was there love at the orphanage? And I was like, well, not in the traditional sense. Nobody tucked me into bed, but there were people that at least cared how I did. You know,
they wanted to see you
succeed. You know, I mean, even though my grandparents, for example, didn't come to my basketball games, I would walk around campus and see Mr. Reeves. He worked down at the maintenance shop. His wife was a counselor, and I'd run into him, and he's like, "I'll tell you what, that was a good game. I mean, you hit that three in the corner, I gave a hoot." You know, and just to even have that kind of support, even though it wasn't my grandparents or somebody, to be in that kind of environment where somebody came to your games and supported you and remembered a shot you made, that builds you up. I was fortunate to be in that environment, and unfortunately people from my past didn't always have that escape route. So I always did, in a way, pity those people. But again, even then, I feel like you can still choose wisely. You can choose the people you want to associate with. I know sometimes it looks like it's easy to find an escape. We always look for that low-hanging fruit. It can be drugs. It can be a bad relationship. You always look for that easy, low-hanging fruit.
Right.
But that's not always a path to happiness. It might feel good in the moment.
Yeah.
In the end, it can be destructive. So unfortunately, I saw a lot of people from my past that ended up in that kind of environment. And like I said, even though you didn't have that lifeline like I did, there were still crossroads in your life where you had to choose a left or a right. It may be harder to choose the right direction given your circumstances, but we always have that choice, which way to go.
A lot of people right now, especially, is like, you got to have a purpose, got to have a purpose. Well, my purpose for this podcast is to really shine light for people who maybe need to make a choice.
Right.
And it might not be that kind of life or death choice. Maybe they're just in a really boring job that's not fulfilling them, but it's also not calling on their greatest gifts.
Right.
And they got a lot more they could be giving people, but for whatever reason, they're holding back or they're comfortable or whatever it might be. So that might be the choice they need to make. And they might not know it yet, or they might need a little push, or they might need to hear a story about someone who's had to overcome a whole lot more than they could imagine. And they're like, well, man, if he can do that, I could probably tell my boss I really want a raise.
Right.
You know? But like you said, everything's relative, and for some people, a lot of that terrifies them. So one other thing I wanted to talk about is there's some things that are in the book that I had questions about, but the one thing toward the end of the book, it never gets talked about. There was that time in the early 2000s where you get to a certain point in your life and your grandparents, like 2 generations above, they start to die off. That happens to everybody if you live long enough. So when that started to happen with your mother's parents, it happened first, and then it happened next with your father's parents. Did he come to the funerals? Did you have to see him there?
Yeah, my father.
How'd that go?
Well, he came to his mother's funeral late. My grandfather kept telling him that time was short. So I wasn't looking forward to it, but for my grandfather, I went and picked my father up at the airport.
Okay.
But he hesitated so long, and he ended up in the end doing this with both his parents. He hesitated so long. I picked him up at the airport, drove him up to Oxford, and as we got to my grandfather's house, the pastor's car was there. My grandmother had passed away before we got there, and of course my father had not escaped anything that he had endured, in the sense that here's my grandfather just lost his wife of 50-something years, and he's talking to my father and asking, did you bring something to wear to a funeral? And my father pulls out a pair of black blue jeans. I mean, that's how he is.
Yeah.
And I just was mortified for my grandfather, because now he's got to go buy his man-child some clothes to wear. He's got to plan his wife's funeral, but instead he's taking his son to go get a haircut. He's taking him to go buy some clothes to wear to a funeral. When my grandfather died, one thing that really perturbed me with my father is because my grandfather hurt my feelings just as much as he hurt his feelings. But my grandfather was a widower for 7 years, and my father never came to visit him. He said he was going to come, quote, take care of Dad, but it was only if he could live in the house next door for free. That's the only thing. If my grandfather wouldn't allow that, then suddenly taking care of Dad wasn't so important. My grandfather eventually, he went to the VA hospital. My father finally decided to come when it was apparent that my grandfather wasn't coming home. And really, it was me getting after him a little bit for him to come. I kind of gave him a strongly worded email, and he finally showed up. But I remember the day my grandfather passed, because I would go visit him. I'd go watch Panthers games with him on Sunday, or the World Series was going on. I'm a Cardinals fan, so we would go. The Cardinals were playing in the World Series that year, and I remember going to watch him with my grandfather at the VA hospital. And I was getting ready to go see him and watch the Panthers that Sunday morning, and the nurse called and said that we needed to go because he was showing signs of dying. And I called my father and told him that, and he was just very haphazard, just very, I'm going to get some coffee then, and I'll be on my way. And I was there holding my grandfather's hand as he passed. And then like maybe 15 minutes later, my father walked in the room. But I was still extraordinarily grateful to him while he was there. He immediately went to my grandfather's house, started trying to rummage through everything. He was trying to get in the safe. My grandfather passed on a Sunday, and my father was trying to get to the safe deposit box on Monday. But I was still extraordinarily graceful to him. I let him borrow a DVD to watch, just didn't give him a piece of my mind or anything like that. Even when we were trying to pick out clothes for my grandfather to be buried in, my father picks out something that looked it was like Disco Inferno or something. He dug in my grandfather's closet and found some stuff from the 70s or something.
Way back, yeah.
So rather than tell him that looks like garbage, I just said, I'll tell you what, I'm gonna grab this suit and we'll let the folks at the funeral home decide what looks best on him. So I was being
Diplomacy,
right. I was being gracious in that way, and I think that speaks a lot of you if you can show people that kind of grace, even if they've hurt you terribly in some cases. If you can show people kindness that hurt you, because any hurt you have, bitterness, they don't care.
Yeah.
They don't care. You're only hurting yourself to hang on to that bitterness. And so I always try to be gracious, even to people who have been hurtful to me. The outfit there was a perfect example, because I knew at the funeral home, they're not going to dress him like Saturday Night Fever here. You know? So
hopefully not.
I really haven't had much interaction with him since then.
Okay.
He tried to bring his wife out, and they were going to try and move into my grandfather's home and all this, but luckily she didn't like it here, so they went back. It's kind of funny because, I traveled all over the country with my father. And then when I went to the orphanage, he lived with his third wife's family for 20 years in one spot. So that was kind of crazy.
That's just so wild.
I do know that people in my family are aware of the book, and I'm sure have read it.
That was going to be the next question. So.
I knew I could potentially burn bridges, but I'm like, some of these bridges you don't mind burning because, they're not bridges to places you want to go, And so,
great way to put it.
So I knew that would be the case. And I was like, well, I've got to be honest and true with the story. I can't sugarcoat it. I can't tone it down for certain people or worried about hurting people's feelings. Because even today I read a review from someone who read it, and they were just talking about it being raw and the emotions coming out of the page and how it impacted them. And that always touches me to read reviews like that, because when you've written something that stirs people's emotions as a writer, that's such a wonderful feeling. Yeah. You've accomplished what you wanted to do. And this was somebody that was indicating in their review that they had been struggling for years. Wow. And when they say that finding your book helped them in some way, it just means so much. The book hasn't made me wealthy. I'm not famous or anything, but when you've impacted people's lives, or somebody from Australia tells you, hey, I loved this book, it's such a wonderful feeling to know you've impacted people. And so I couldn't have that impact if I was worried about what other people were saying or worried about hurting people's feelings.
Right. So no one who's in the book has called you up and said, that's not the way it happened at all. I don't remember it like that.
No, nothing like that.
How long has the book been out as of this conversation?
Gosh, it might be almost 4 years now, maybe. Now
Okay.
I think it might be almost 4 years right off the top of my head.
Okay. Now, have you, since college, talked to other people who have gone through your situation, like with the orphanage and groups like that?
I've actually spoken with folks that lived at the orphanage with me. I mean, the book has been a real blessing in the sense, like I said, it hadn't made me wealthy or anything like that, but I'm always so happy to sign a copy for people.
Yeah.
It can really make somebody feel really good. And, and even just last Saturday, I was asked to donate a signed copy. The orphanage where I grew up was having a fundraising gala. So I donated a signed copy and then attended the gala, and just to see that something that I'd written about my experience there to go toward raising money to help this generation of kids was such a rewarding experience. And I was even given the honor of what they call the Dan Rice Orphans Friend Award. I was given that while I was there. Unexpected, did not have any previous knowledge that it was going to happen. I was really moved by that. To see people recognize that you're trying to make a difference, that you're contributing to something good, that's a reward. So if I made $1 million writing the book, of course not. but that award where people recognize that you've done something good is just worth that much.
You're talking about the impact of the book and the ways that it's helped you feel like you're helping people. And I get the sense, because throughout the book you talk about you've always wanted to be a writer. You love movies, you love stories. I get the sense that this is maybe not your last book.
No, I've actually already got a second one that I've written and published. It's a piece of historical fiction that takes place around the Battle of Bentonville here in North Carolina.
Okay.
Currently working on a third. Nice. Always getting ideas in your head for other ones. I'm very much still in that mindset of that kid in the 6th grade who sat there on the floor with a box on my lap and drew a picture and came up with a story to go with it. And I hope I never lose that. That I always have that creativity and that want to. When life gets hard, it's like a nice way to escape into your imagination and get with these characters and get with these things that are happening. It's 100 degrees outside right now, And the book I'm writing now takes place during a winter storm. So it's like you just get into a whole different
you
place.
You got to channel a whole different kind of feeling. And I got to say in the book, and I want to ask you in a second, what's the best way for people to get the book. But this book, if you are of a certain age, if you are that Gen X generation, this book's got a soundtrack to it.
Yeah.
And you were very intentional, it seemed like, about bringing us into what you were hearing in the car on these long, long road trips. And probably, at least if not every story or chapter, or every other chapter would have kind of the playlist that was going on in the background. I was like, yeah, I remember where I was when that song came out. And all that stuff was so fun to read.
That was natural and intentional. It was intentional but natural, because just like everybody, you hear a song and it takes you back to a certain place. And so as I wrote about these experiences, I remembered certain things. You know, going to movies were such an escape for me. Even when I was homeless, going to a discount theater just to get out of the heat for a while and see a movie. And at the orphanage, having those memories of going up to the old Orpheum Theater in downtown Oxford and going to see a scary movie with a bunch of orphanage friends, and you know, hearing the girl scream and all that. And just those things are, like you said, that's the soundtrack of our lives. These songs that we've all listened to, and they remind you of certain times, certain places, certain things. And so they were kind of like bookmarks along my journey.
I thought it was so cool to see that used, because in some ways, no matter how chaotic in your life and your travels and all the things that were swirling around you, that seemed to bring you comfort.
Yeah.
And if people couldn't bring you comfort, you at least got comfort from sounds coming through the speakers or what you were seeing on the screen.
Yeah.
Not necessarily comfort on the screen. That was sort of a distraction from
but it was like
what's going on. But
kind of like you said, it was like sometimes even in college, for example, having come from an orphanage, I didn't always have anywhere to go for the holidays or something, so I would stay on campus during a holiday. Some summers I would work right there on campus, and sometimes that could be a lonely feeling. That's one thing I guess maybe I didn't even mention in the book as much, is that loneliness that comes with when you've lived that kind of existence of being an orphan, being homeless. It can be lonely at times. And so if I went to the movies, I wasn't by myself anymore. I was at the movies. I was around people and that kind of thing. We're having this shared experience. So it kind of helped alleviate some of that stuff. And again, just being able to relax and listen to music or go shoot basketball or something. Just do something that takes you out of whatever grind you're in or whatever muck you're in. Sometimes that stuff can kind of help pull you out of that. And even if you're by yourself, you may create a memory.
Yeah, and those memories, if you get enough of them, you can put them down into a journal, into a book, like you've done. And if someone listening right now, they've been hearing us talk for quite a while now about your story and what happened. All of this is, well, 98% of it anyway is in the book. And there's a whole lot more in the book that we haven't even talked about. So we haven't given really anything away. But if someone wants to go get the book, where's the best place for them to do
Pretty
that?
much get it anywhere.
Okay.
You can get it through Amazon, paperback, or Kindle. If you prefer ebooks like Apple Books, you can get it from Apple.
Okay.
Barnes & Noble, you can get it on the Nook. You can order it. Most bookstores like Barnes & Noble, your mom and pop bookstores may not have it, but they can order it for you and have it sent. The little independent bookstore I visited in Oxford, Angel Wings Bookstore, they've got signed copies. I've had signed copies there. So if you're in the Oxford area, you can certainly go get one there at Angel Wings. But pretty much anywhere you get books, you can order it.
Well, it was definitely a good read, and like you said, as a writer, you want to stir emotions in people, and boy, there were a lot of those going on. There was one part where I forgot which one it was, but I laughed out loud, and then there were a lot of parts where I just wanted to go John Wick on a couple of people.
I tried to mix in a little humor. That was my fear in writing it, was that I didn't want people to read it and then go out and buy a rope. You know, that was my fear, because I knew there was a lot of rough stuff in there. And so I would always encourage people to stick with it. There's going to be some hard parts that you got to get through. But ultimately, it's a story about perseverance, about never giving up, about picking yourself up one more time than you fall. And if you do that, eventually you're going to be able to stand. So I tried to mix in a little humor here and there. I still joke about my car that burst into flames, you know. Miserable when it happened.
I was going to say, just in reading this and going along this journey with you, we went through a lot of cars in this book. Between your father bought the crappiest cars and then rode them till they died, and then you didn't have great luck with cars
I didn't
yourself.
either. No, I'm fortunate to laugh. I bought my first new car like several years ago, and so far, knock on wood, it's been good. So
things turn around.
Yeah, but some of my friends would joke about, like, I was like the Bugs Bunny cartoon where the one little storm cloud would follow the guy around. Like, some of my buddies would talk about that was me. Get an enlistment bonus in the Army, come out, I'm gonna buy a car, I'm gonna like get back to school, buy the car, and 4 hours later it burst into flames.
You had it for 4 hours and it
And I mean, it burned to a crisp.
Man.
I even made a joke about it in my speech to the orphanage several weeks ago. But again, that's that transformation where with something painful, you can laugh about it one day, hopefully.
Hopefully.
You know?
So on the back, when it describes you and tells a little bit about you, this is what caught my eye because this is something you and I have in common, and I need to know more. It says, when he isn't writing, you may find Shayne hiking in the mountains of his home state or trying one of the numerous barbecue restaurants the state is known for. Now, I don't hike, but I do go to some barbecue restaurants. And so you're from Oxford. Is there anything around there that is worth noting and talking about?
I haven't been in a long time in Oxford. I used to go to Skipper's up in Henderson. Skipper's barbecue was pretty decent back in the day. I'll tell you one that, if you don't mind a little drive, that is really worth it.
Okay.
Me and a buddy were trying to hit as many places in the North Carolina barbecue trail as we could.
Yeah.
And there's a little place called Grady's.
Okay.
It's out past Goldsboro a little bit. I think.
All right.
Can't remember the exact name of the town, but Grady's.
Grady's.
It's great. This little family apparently runs it. It's just a little cinder block type building.
Those are the best.
They got a picnic shelter out back that you can go sit on. But man, that stuff was good. And they got a bunch of sides. I got a barbecue plate, but I'm planning to go back again sometime and get like a sandwich and then a vegetable plate. They have really good butter beans, black eyed peas, that kind of thing.
See, the sides at those places, that's what really makes it.
Grady's would be the one that I would really recommend highly right now.
All right.
And then if you ever get out to Western North Carolina, I think the best Western is a place, ironically, right near Gardner Webb in Shelby. Is Red Bridge's Barbecue Lodge. It's really good.
Gotcha. The last really good one, and this is going to seem so obvious, but I'd never been there, but I lived around Greensboro for a long time, which is not crazy far from Lexington. I was traveling from Raleigh to Charlotte and headed back from Charlotte, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to stop at this place called Lexington Barbecue. Went in there, changed your life. It was so good. And I like some barbecue, so I know a lot of barbecue, but that was good barbecue.
Yeah. If you like Lexington, you'll like Red Bridges down in Shelby. I've been to Stamey's over in Greensboro, which is also on the trail. Hershey's I've been to. But the one that really stands out to me, my favorite right now, would be Grady's. They're really good. And like I said, it's just old country folks. They had a spiral notebook, and if it's your first time, they ask you to sign the spiral notebook.
Well, how about that?
So really
That's
nice,
cool.
super nice folks there.
I like it. Now, are you one of those people who gets in the fist fights about like Eastern or Western sauce?
With some of my college buddies who are from Western North Carolina, we'll have our debates. It's kind of comical. Yeah, obviously I'm partial, having grown up in Oxford, I'm partial to Eastern North Carolina barbecue. Like sometimes Smithfield's, which is a chain. Yeah. Smithfield's is really good for a chain. And I think some of their stuff's better than some of this. This is going to sound blasphemous, but Smithfield's is as good as some of the stuff I've had on the barbecue trail. I mean, it's really that good. And
I agree with that.
So I'll tell them.
I agree with that.
Yeah. I'll tell them, my buddies that are all Western, I'm like, y'all ever get a Smithfield's up here? It's going to change everything.
Yeah. I will eat up a Smithfield's plate. Yeah.
Old Time Barbecue. It's in Raleigh, a little cinder block type place. They've got some really good hush puppies and Brunswick stew at Old Time.
I love some Brunswick stew.
I don't think they're too awful far from the fairgrounds, kind of like going toward Cary there.
Yeah. I got to go check that out.
But Old Time's pretty good.
I'm surprised I haven't. I probably have, but it's been a while.
I haven't been there in a while, but I do try to support them. It's actually owned by a father and son Mason. Which, the Masons support the orphanage where I grew up. Supporting them supports my home. Sure. And again, that's one of the best things about the book is being able to give back, to donate a copy to be auctioned off, or I've done that for animal rescues or for the home, or just to give somebody one, just to cheer them up. Just such a thrill to read a review where somebody says it came to them at a certain time when they needed it, or it touched their life. I would never want to live my life over again and endure those things. But when you see that there was a purpose to it, that it's helping somebody else, it makes it like it wasn't worth nothing. It was worthwhile to endure that if it helped somebody else.
Yeah, wow. Shayne, thank you so much for having this conversation.
I enjoyed it.
Yeah, this has been a roller coaster. It kind of goes up and goes down. There are the light parts and the heavy parts, and I think anyone listening to it gets a real sense of the depth of things that you've experienced, but also what came through that. Even me reading the book, even when things were really, really dark, I was thinking, well, okay, Shayne wrote this book. Like, he's probably all right now. Like, wherever he's sitting, he's cool. Yeah. Even though this happened like 40 something years ago, and that kept me reading because I was like, okay, we got to see how he got to where he is now.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing. Thank you for being vulnerable and writing this story.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a strength in vulnerability, believe it or not. There's a strength in opening yourself up like that to share and maybe help somebody else, you know.
Well, thank you for sharing with us.
No,
I really appreciate it.
I enjoyed it. Thank you. I'm glad to do it.
Thanks for joining me today. If you've enjoyed this content and are thinking about ways to share your story or even get more joy out of your life, I have a free ebook that I'd love to share with you. It's called Plotting Your Joyful Rebellion, and I designed it to be a 5-step field guide full of guerrilla warfare tactics to help prepare you to overthrow any of the parts of your life you feel the call to rebel against. Go to ajoyfulrebellion.com and click on the link right there at the top to claim your free copy of the book. Again, that's ajoyfulrebellion.com, or simply hit the link at the top of the show notes. What sort of rebellion are you plotting right now? I'd love to hear about it. Connect with me on Facebook, Instagram, or through the website at ajoyfulrebellion.com. Thanks again for listening today, and be sure to stop by next week for another episode full of joyful rebellion.